My name is David Hunt, and until the day the first letter arrived, I thought I knew everything about my life. I'm 41, an insurance adjuster, and I've been married to Laura for 15 years. We have two kids, a comfortable home in the suburbs, and a routine that, while not exciting, felt secure, predictable. But in hindsight, perhaps that was part of the problem. Security can breed complacency, and complacency can blind you to the cracks forming beneath the surface. The letter arrived on a Monday tucked among the usual stack of bills and flyers. I didn't notice anything unusual at first, just a plain white envelope with no return address, addressed to me in blocky, handwritten letters. I assumed it was junk mail, but when I tore it open, I found a single sheet of paper with a few short sentences typed in bold. Your wife is having an affair. If you want proof, look at the park on Elm Street. Thursday afternoon. You'll see everything. I stared at the letter, my brain struggling to process the words. At first, I thought it was a joke or some sort of bizarre scam. Laura, an affair. It didn't make sense. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, a devoted mother, the kind of person who made homemade cookies for bake sales and remembered everyone's birthdays. She wasn't capable of something like this. Still, the letter unsettled me. I reread it, looking for clues, an identifying mark, a hint of who might have sent it. But there was nothing. The envelope was blank aside from my name and address, and the letter itself had been printed on plain white paper. No signature, no details, no hint of the sender's identity. I tucked the letter into my desk drawer, telling myself it was nonsense. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The words lingered in the back of my mind, creeping into every quiet moment. By the time Thursday rolled around, I had convinced myself that I needed to go, if only to prove to myself that it was a lie. That afternoon, I left work early, telling my boss I wasn't feeling well. The park on Elm Street was small and quiet, a place we'd taken the kids when they were younger. I parked my car a block away and walked in, my heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and shame. What if someone saw me? What if this was all just a cruel prank? I found a bench near the edge of the park and sat down, pretending to check my phone while scanning the area. For a while, nothing happened. The park was almost empty, just a few joggers and an older man walking his dog. I started to feel foolish, like I'd been duped into wasting my afternoon. And then I saw her. Laura walked into the park from the opposite side, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize walked beside her, his hand brushing hers as they laughed together. My stomach churned as I watched them sit down on a nearby bench, their heads close as they spoke in low voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. The way she looked at him, the way she leaned into him when he spoke, it was all too familiar. I had seen that same look when we first started dating, back when we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Now it was directed at someone else. I sat frozen, my mind racing. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And who had sent the letter? My first instinct was to confront them, to march over and demand answers. But something stopped me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos from a distance, my hands trembling as I tried to keep the camera steady. I left the park before they could see me, my head spinning with questions and doubts. By the time I got home, I felt like I was going to explode. Laura was already there, standing in the kitchen as she prepared dinner. She smiled when she saw me, her expression warm and familiar. "Hey," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're home early. Everything okay?" I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, just a slow day at work." She nodded, turning back to the stove as if nothing had changed. I stood there watching her, wondering how she could act so normal when my entire world had just been turned upside down. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in the park. The letter, the man, the way she had smiled at him. It all felt like a bad dream. But the photos on my phone were proof that it was real. And as much as I wanted to confront her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed more answers first. The next morning, I opened my desk drawer and stared at the letter. Who had sent it? And why? Someone knew about Laura's affair, someone who had gone out of their way to tell me. But their motives were still a mystery, I didn't know it yet, but the letter was just the beginning. The morning after I saw Laura in the park, the house felt like a stranger's. She moved through her routines effortlessly, brushing the kids' hair, packing lunches, humming as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I stood by the counter, my mind still tangled in the memory of her sitting on that bench with him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she glanced at me. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She smiled back, warm and oblivious. It should have comforted me, but it didn't. How could she stand there so calm and composed after what I'd seen? Did she think I was too blind or too trusting to notice? When she left for work, I sat at the dining table, staring at the photos on my phone. The man in the picture was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a confident posture. He looked younger than me, maybe in his mid-30s. But beyond that, I had nothing to go on. Who was he? And what had drawn Laura to him? Before I could spiral further, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my first thought was a delivery. But when I opened the door, there was no package, just another envelope sitting on the welcome mat. My name was scrawled across the front in the same blocky handwriting as before. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The street was quiet, with no sign of the person who'd left it. I shut the door and ripped the envelope open, pulling out another typed letter. "You've seen the proof. If you want to know who he is, go to the Cedar Inn tomorrow night at 8 p.m., room 214. The Cedar Inn was a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place Laura or I would ever stay, but I knew it well enough. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. Whoever was sending these letters wasn't just trying to expose Laura's affair. They wanted me to do something about it. For the rest of the day, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. Every scenario ran through my mind. Was this some kind of trap? Would I walk into room 214 and find Laura there with him? Or was this about something more? I couldn't shake the feeling that the person behind the letters had a personal stake in this. That night, I barely slept. Laura lay beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful, while my thoughts spiraled out of control. I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. Had she seemed distant? Had there been signs? Or had I been too wrapped up in work and family life to notice the cracks forming in our marriage? The next day, I left work early again, unable to focus on anything else. The hours dragged until it was finally time to go. As I drove to the Cedar Inn, my chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and dread. The motel loomed ahead, its flickering neon sign casting a faint red glow over the parking lot. I pulled in and parked near the back, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the door to room 214. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving, but I had come this far, and I needed answers. Steeling myself, I got out of the car and approached the door. My heart pounded as I knocked, the sound echoing in the still night air. The door opened slowly, and for a split second, I braced myself to see Laura, or worse, her lover. But instead, I found a woman standing there, her face partially hidden in the shadow of the room. She was younger, mid-30s at most, with short dark hair and piercing green eyes. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You're David," she said, her voice calm and steady. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I did. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a bed, a chair, and a table littered with papers. She shut the door behind me and turned to face me. "My name's Sarah," she said, "and I'm the one who sent the letters." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Why?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she walked over to the table, picking up a photo and holding it out to me. I took it reluctantly, my breath catching as I recognized the man in the picture. The same man from the park. "That's my husband," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "His name's Eric. He's been sleeping with your wife." The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "How do you know?" "I've known for weeks," Sarah said, her tone sharp. "I found the texts, the emails. He's been meeting her at the park, at this motel, wherever they think no one will notice. I couldn't confront him, I'm not ready for that, but I thought you deserved to know. Her words hit me like a freight train. I sank into the chair, the photo still clutched in my hand. Why not just tell me everything up front? I asked weakly. Why the letters? Because I didn't know if you believe me, she said. People don't like hearing the truth about their spouses. I thought if you saw it for yourself, you'd understand. I looked up at her, my anger and confusion giving way to a different emotion. Despair. What do you want from me? Sarah's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Determination. I want us to work together, she said. If we're going to stop them, we need to figure out what's really going on. Sarah's words hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. Work together. The idea of teaming up with a stranger to investigate my wife's affair felt surreal, like I was a character in someone else's twisted story. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the photo of Eric. Why do you even care about what I do? I asked. If you already know about the affair, why not just confront him and be done with it? Sarah folded her arms, her gaze steady. Because this isn't just about him or me, it's about both of us. They've been lying to us, sneaking around behind our backs. Don't you want to know the truth? Don't you want to stop it? Her words stung because they echoed my own thoughts. I did want the truth. I wanted to know how long this had been going on, what Laura had told Eric, and what she hadn't told me. But the idea of teaming up with Sarah felt strange, almost invasive. What would this investigation accomplish, beyond making the pain more tangible? Still, I couldn't deny that she had answers I didn't, and as much as I hated the situation, I knew I couldn't untangle it on my own. What exactly are you proposing? I asked cautiously. Sarah pulled out a small folder from the stack of papers on the table and handed it to me. Inside were screenshots of text messages and emails between Eric and Laura. My stomach twisted as I scanned the exchanges. Eric, I can't stop thinking about yesterday. You're amazing. Laura, you make me feel alive again. I can't wait for next time. Eric, same spot tomorrow? Usual time? Laura, of course, just tell me when. The dates on the messages stretched back for months. Each one was like a dagger to the heart, confirming what I had feared since I saw them at the park. I've been keeping track of him, Sarah said, her tone clinical, as if discussing a case file. His movements, his messages, everything. He's careful, but not careful enough. If we combine what we know, we can figure out how to handle this. I closed the folder and set it on the table, my hands trembling. And what does handle this mean to you? That's up to you, Sarah said. But I think we both deserve closure, don't you? Closure. The word sounded hollow, but I nodded. Fine, I said. What do you have in mind? The plan, as Sarah laid it out, was simple. Keep watching, keep gathering evidence, and confront them when the time was right. It felt calculated, almost cold, but I couldn't argue with her logic. Charging in without proof would only give Laura and Eric a chance to deny everything. And as much as I hated waiting, I knew Sarah was right. We needed to be sure. Over the next week, we worked together in secret. Sarah was meticulous, tracking Eric's movements and cataloging their meetings. She'd call or text me updates whenever she spotted them together, and I'd do the same if I noticed anything unusual about Laura's behavior. It was a strange alliance built on shared betrayal and mutual anger. I learned more about Sarah during those long conversations. She'd been married to Eric for 8 years, no kids, and had suspected something was off for months before finding the messages. She spoke about him with a mix of bitterness and sadness, as if mourning the man she thought she'd married. Do you think he ever loved you? I asked one evening as we sat in my car outside a cafe where Eric and Laura were meeting. Sarah hesitated, staring out the window. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe he did once, but love doesn't look like this, does it? Her words hit me harder than I expected. Did Laura still love me? Or had she replaced our life together with something new, something she thought was better? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I didn't voice it. A week later, we got the break we'd been waiting for. Sarah called me early in the morning, her voice tense. Eric left his phone unlocked, she said. I found messages about a weekend trip. They're planning to meet at a cabin about an hour from here. My chest tightened. When? This Saturday, she said. I think it's time. She didn't need to elaborate. I knew what she meant. This was our chance to confront them, to force the truth out into the open. As much as I dreaded the confrontation, I knew it was inevitable. That Saturday, Sarah and I drove separately to the cabin, parking far enough away to avoid being noticed. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling the air, as we crept through the trees toward the small, secluded structure. My heart pounded with every step, a mix of fear, anger, and anticipation surging through me. Through the window, I saw them, Laura and Eric, sitting together on the couch, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. The sight of her so relaxed, so happy, with someone else felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Sarah touched my arm, her expression unreadable. Are you ready? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. Together, we walked to the door and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet forest, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the door opened, and Laura's smile faded as she saw me standing there, Sarah at my side. David, she said, her voice trembling. What are you? We need to talk, I said, my tone colder than I intended. Eric appeared behind her, his face paling as he took in the scene. Sarah, he stammered. What's going on? You tell us, Sarah said, her voice sharp. Or should we start? The silence that followed Sarah's words was deafening. Laura and Eric stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale as the weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. For a fleeting second, I thought they might try to deny everything, to brush this off as some bizarre coincidence. But the guilt in their eyes told me that they knew they'd been caught. David, Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? I think you know, I replied coldly, stepping past her into the cabin. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the wine glasses on the coffee table, the lit fireplace, and the open suitcase by the couch. It was every bit the romantic getaway I'd feared it would be. Eric moved to stand beside Laura, his hands raised slightly as if trying to diffuse the tension. Look, this isn't... Don't, Sarah interrupted, stepping into the room behind me. Her voice was sharp, but her composure was unnerving. Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this, Eric. We know everything. Laura turned to me, her expression a mix of guilt and panic. David, please, let me explain. Explain what? I snapped, my voice rising. Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back for months? How you lied to my face over and over? I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, tears welling in her eyes. It got out of control. Out of control? I repeated bitterly. So what? You just tripped and fell into an affair? Eric opened his mouth, but Sarah silenced him with a glare. Don't, she warned. You've done enough damage. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the unspoken truce hanging between us like a storm ready to break. How long? I finally asked, my voice cracking. How long has this been going on? Laura looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping. 6 months, she admitted quietly. Maybe 7. The admission hit me like a physical blow. 7 months. For 7 months, she had been living a double life, smiling at me over dinner and tucking our kids into bed while sneaking off to meet him. The betrayal was staggering. And you? Sarah asked, her voice icy as she turned to Eric. How long have you been lying to me? He hesitated, then sighed. About the same, he said reluctantly. I didn't want... Save it, Sarah snapped. You didn't want to get caught. That's the only thing you cared about. Laura reached out toward me, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling vast. David, I never stopped loving you, she said desperately. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt lost, and Eric... Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't try to justify this. You made a choice, Laura. You both did. Eric finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised. This isn't just her fault, he said. We didn't plan this. It just happened. It just happened? Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. What a convenient excuse. Do you even hear yourselves? I turned to Eric, my anger boiling over. You don't get to stand here and act like some innocent bystander. You knew she was married. You knew she had a family. And you still decided you didn't care. He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away, his shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I don't want your apology, I snapped. I want the truth. All of it. Eric hesitated, but Laura spoke first. We didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, tears streaming down her face. We were just talking at first. It was innocent, I swear. But then, but then what? I demanded. You decided our marriage wasn't enough for you. It wasn't like that, she insisted. I didn't stop loving you, David. I felt invisible, like I wasn't enough. The words hit me hard, but they didn't soften the blow of her betrayal. So instead of talking to me, you found someone else? I asked, my voice rising again. That's how you fix things? Laura sobbed, covering her face with her hands, but I felt no sympathy. I turned to Eric, my voice sharp. And what about you? What's your excuse? He glanced at Sarah, his face etched with guilt. I don't have one, he admitted. I screwed up. I hurt you both, and I'll have to live with that. You're damn right you will, Sarah said coldly. But this isn't over. Not yet. What does that mean? Laura asked, her voice trembling. It means you don't just walk away from something like this without consequences, I said. You've destroyed 2 marriages, 2 lives. You don't get to pretend this didn't happen. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of everything we'd said hanging between us. Then Sarah spoke, her voice calm but firm. We're leaving, but don't think this is the end of this conversation. I nodded, my anger simmering beneath the surface as I turned toward the door. Laura reached out again, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. As Sarah and I walked out into the cool evening air, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a hollow sense of relief. The truth was out now, raw and undeniable. But where we went from here was still uncertain. We'll figure this out, Sarah said quietly as we reached the cars, one way or another. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed her. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The drive home from the cabin felt like an eternity. The weight of the confrontation sat heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Sarah's words echoed in my mind. We'll figure this out. But what did that even mean? Was there a way to fix this mess? And if there was, did I even want to? When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Laura wasn't back yet, which gave me time to think, or at least try. I sat on the couch, staring at the photos I had taken at the park, the text messages Sarah had shown me, and the memories of the cabin seared into my mind. Every piece of evidence felt like another crack in the foundation of my marriage. The front door opened an hour later, and Laura walked in. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged and her shoulders slumped. For a moment, she just stood there, as if unsure whether to come in or turn around and leave. We need to talk, I said, my voice flat. She nodded, stepping into the living room but keeping her distance. David, Sit, I interrupted, motioning to the chair across from me. No excuses, no deflections. I want the truth, all of it. She hesitated, then sank into the chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. What do you want to know? She asked quietly. Everything, I said. How it started, how long it's been going on, why you thought it was worth risking everything we've built. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't soften. I couldn't. Not yet. It started at that fundraiser back in March, she began, her voice trembling. Eric and I ended up at the same table. We talked a little, about work, about life. It was innocent, I swear. But then, we kept running into each other. At the gym, at the grocery store, and we started texting. Texting, I repeated, my tone sharp. That's how it always starts, isn't it? She flinched but continued. It didn't feel like a big deal at first. Just someone to talk to, someone who listened. But then it got deeper. We started meeting in person. Coffee at first, then the park, and then... Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. And then it wasn't just coffee anymore. I finished for her, my voice cold. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to happen, David. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you. I felt so disconnected. From you, from myself. Eric made me feel seen. Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay composed. And I didn't? I asked. Did you ever think about talking to me? About telling me how you were feeling? I didn't know how, she admitted, her voice breaking. I thought you'd just brush it off, like you always do. That's not fair, I shot back. I've always supported you, Laura. I've always been here for you. I know, she said, her voice soft. But sometimes it felt like you were here, but not really here. Like we were just going through the motions. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time resenting her for what she'd done that I hadn't stopped to consider my own role in our marriage. Had I been as present as I thought? Or had I let myself get too comfortable, assuming everything was fine because it was easier than digging deeper? Why didn't you end it? I asked after a long silence. If you knew it was wrong, why didn't you stop? I tried, she said, her voice barely audible. 100 times I told myself I would end it. But every time I saw him, it was like I couldn't. Her confession cut deep, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't just about me or our marriage. Laura had made her choices, and she had to own them. But I couldn't carry the burden of fixing this alone. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. That depends on you, I said. If you want any chance of fixing this, you need to cut all contact with him, block his number, delete his messages, everything. I will, she said quickly. I swear. And we're going to counseling, I added. If we're going to rebuild anything, it has to start there. She nodded, her expression a mix of relief and fear. Okay, but don't think this is forgiveness, I warned. This is just a chance. One chance. And if you screw it up, we're done. She swallowed hard, nodding again. I understand. That night after Laura went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the stack of evidence Sarah and I had gathered. The weight of everything felt unbearable, but there was one loose thread I couldn't ignore. Sarah. Her calm, calculated approach to exposing the affair had been invaluable, but it also left me unsettled. She had told me she wanted closure, but there was something about her demeanor that nagged at me, like she wasn't telling me the whole story. The next day I called her. She picked up on the second ring. David, she said, how are you holding up? Not great, I admitted, but I've been thinking. Why did you really do this? She hesitated, and for the first time since we met, her voice wavered. What do you mean? I mean, why go through all this trouble? The letters, the meeting at the cabin. It feels like more than just closure. There was a long pause, and then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. Because this isn't the first time he's done this, she said quietly, and I needed to make sure it was the last. Let me know if you're ready for part 6. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. This isn't the first time he's done this. My grip on the phone tightened, my mind racing with questions. She'd been calm, collected, and focused during the investigation. But now there was something raw in her voice, something I hadn't heard before. What do you mean? I asked carefully. What haven't you told me? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a long sigh. Eric has a history, she said finally. This isn't the first affair, David. He's done this before, more than once. And every time I believed him when he said he'd change, I forgave him. But this time it's different. Different how? I pressed, though part of me already suspected the answer. Because it's with someone else's wife, she said, her voice trembling. Because it's not just my life he's wrecking. It's yours too. Her admission stung, but it also filled me with a strange sense of clarity. Sarah wasn't just seeking closure for herself. She was trying to prevent me from making the same mistakes she had. She'd seen the cycle play out with Eric before and knew how it would end if nothing changed. What do you want from me, Sarah? I asked, my voice quieter now. I want him to face the consequences, she said firmly. For once in his life, he needs to see what his actions have done. Not just to me, but to you, to Laura, to everyone he's lied to. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling over me. And Laura? I asked. What about her? That's up to you, she said. But if you're asking for my advice, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let this break you without deciding what you're willing to fight for. That evening, I sat down with Laura for what would be the most difficult conversation of our marriage. She had spent the day clearing out Eric's messages, deleting his number, and writing a letter of resignation from the committee where they'd met. She told me she was committed to repairing our relationship, but the words felt hollow. Trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. I spoke to Sarah today, I said, breaking the silence. Laura flinched, her hands gripping her mug of tea. What did she say? She told me this wasn't Eric's first affair. Her eyes widened, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. I didn't know that. Didn't you? I asked, my tone sharp. Or did you just not want to know? Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. I didn't, she said softly. But maybe I should have. Maybe I ignored the signs because I didn't want to face what I was doing. I nodded, her honesty cutting deeper than any excuse could have. Sarah thinks Eric needs to face the consequences, I said. And I agree. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. It means Sarah and I are going to make sure he doesn't do this again. To anyone. The next day, Sarah and I met at her lawyer's office. She had compiled a mountain of evidence. Text messages, emails, receipts, and even a detailed timeline of Eric's movements over the past year. Together, we drafted a letter outlining his actions and the potential legal and personal ramifications if he didn't take responsibility. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Sarah made it clear that she wanted a divorce, and I knew I was standing at a crossroads in my own marriage. Laura had taken steps to show she wanted to change, but the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Eric didn't take the news well. When Sarah and I handed him the letter at his office, he looked pale, his confident demeanor crumbling as he read the contents. You can't do this, he said, his voice panicked. This will ruin me. You've already ruined yourself, Sarah replied coldly. We're just holding up the mirror. He looked at me, his expression desperate. David, you don't have to go along with this. Think about what this will do to Laura. Don't, I said, cutting him off. You don't get to use her as leverage. You made your choices. Now you live with them. He didn't argue after that. The letter outlined clear conditions. He would end all contact with Laura, agree to the divorce settlement Sarah had drafted, and attend therapy to address his behavior. If he refused, we would expose the full extent of his affairs to his employer, family, and friends. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Sarah moved forward with her divorce, and Eric disappeared from our lives. Laura and I started couples counseling, but every session felt like walking through a minefield. Trust was hard to rebuild, and some days I wondered if it ever would be. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Laura turned to me. Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were? She asked. No, I said honestly, but maybe we can find something new, something better. She nodded, her hand slipping into mine. I hope so. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, and for now that was enough.